All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brett Scharfs, and I am the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And it's my pleasure to moderate this panel with a group of emerging professionals, all law students at the University of Texas, Austin. They're all participants in the First Amendment Center, has a religious freedom clinic, and they are all advanced students, which means they are in their at least second iteration of participation in the Religious Freedom Clinic. And they are all students of Professor Steve Collis, who is here. And thank you, Steve, for bringing this great group of students. He's given me the Longhorns here. Perhaps he wants another shout out for the University of Texas and their football team. So go Longhorns. If that sounded half-hearted, perhaps it was. But we're really happy to be here in Dallas, and really grateful to the Board of Advisors and the board of the Dallas-Fort Worth Religious Freedom and Human Dignity Alliance. It's hard to do things over and over, and to have us here for the 7th annual gathering is, I think, a significant milestone and a real achievement. So what we're going to do with this panel is our three speakers have each prepared about 10 minutes to talk a little bit about their perspectives on finding common ground in religious freedom and human dignity from the perspective of emerging professionals. And then after that, we'll have some time for moderated discussion and I hope also some questions from the audience. So listen carefully and think of questions you might like to ask. And we're going to begin with Zachary Alkire, and he is going to be followed by Matthew Zavarro, and then Hannah Botorf will be our third speaker. So Zach, over to you.
First, I want to thank you guys for the opportunity just to come speak with you guys all about a topic that we all care about, otherwise we wouldn't be here. When I was writing this, I was kind of looking through the speaker panel and all the different cool things everyone's done. And I took, just a moment. I was like, what can I add to this that's kind of unique? Or, I'm 24 in law school. And with some honest self-reflection, I was like, there's probably not much. But, the one thing that I think I can add, and it's not unique, but I do think it occupies kind of a less common position, is the fact that I'm a secular person who feels very fiercely defensive of the rights of religious people. And I didn't line this up with the prior panel, but I think that this was almost kind of called for in their discussion. And I think that the common adage up until now has been that we should just kind of respect people because that's the right thing to do. Kind of the golden rule. It's what you're taught just going through life. And that's certainly what motivates me, and I think I derive a lot of my value for religious freedom from. However, I think even for people who are unconvinced by that principle alone, there are distinct advantages that flow from allowing religious liberty to proliferate. And recognizing those benefits might be the key to finding common ground, and I know it was for me. And academics have long discussed this topic, and they've bantered back and forth about it. And after doing some research, I discovered that our own moderator had written an excellent article on this point. And the article is very profound, and I would recommend to anyone interested in this topic. But I'm not really going to go in that direction. Instead of diving deeply into legal theory or morals, I want to make the argument kind of from my perspective and how I arrived at my conclusion. So the way that I kind of want to elicit this is by first looking at how legal actions in the past have, initiated by these religious individuals and groups, have led to significant advancements in our rights that extend well beyond religious contexts. And what I mean by this is that it doesn't just expand the free exercise right in a lot of these cases. It hits all sorts of rights that we all value today. And then after looking at 2 or 3 of those kind of easy cases, I would like to briefly look at some of the harder cases that elicit tougher issues that people might find controversial. But I think even that has value to it. Because if we look at my position is that we look at both of these case archetypes, we can find advantages. On the one hand, those easy cases kind of provide something that everyone gets to enjoy. Everybody likes having strong free speech rights. Everybody likes parental rights. Those are the kind of things that go without saying. On the other hand, the harder cases kind of help us shape our opinions and shape what we think public discourse should look like. And what I hope to kind of elicit by examining these cases, both easy and hard, is that religious people have just an extra push to go out into the world that I feel secular people like myself just don't have. And the impact of that little push to go out in the world, in my mind, makes all the difference. Kind of an unsatisfactory way that I've been thinking about this is that religious people have something else compared to secular people. They have something else that brings them out from their daily lives and makes them go do things in the world. And that is enormously helpful in kind of developing our civil liberties regime. So naturally, I'm going to start with the easy cases. And I think that my favorite of all of these is West Virginia School Board of Education versus Barnett. And this is a case where Jehovah's Witness students, in line with their religion, refused to salute the flag or recite the Pledge of Allegiance when it was time in class to do that. To make a long and pretty sad story short, the students and their parents faced retaliation for continuing to refuse to salute the flag or recite the Pledge of Allegiance in line with their religion. And the impact of this case wasn't limited just to those students. The Supreme Court held that individuals cannot be forced to express beliefs that they do not believe. This kind of formed the basis for our modern compelled speech doctrine. And it also gave us probably the coolest quote of all time from Justice Jackson, who wrote that, quote, "If there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein," end quote. And Barnett kind of enjoys this special place in our constitutional law. If you take a First Amendment class, every single class is going to spend like 3 days on this. The First Amendment professor is going to be so excited talking about it. And I think that's important in a sense that it was religious people who started that case, but I think looking at a lesser known case like Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York versus Village of Stratton is equally valuable. This case involved an ordinance that required canvassers to register before engaging in door-to-door advocacy. Naturally, this was targeted at Jehovah's Witnesses, and a group of Jehovah's Witnesses intent on doing just that challenged the law. But the court invalidated the ordinance, and they reinforced the right to communicate ideas directly to the public without government approval. And this one really struck me, because this case isn't that old at all. And this seems like one of those rights that kind of goes without saying. But without these religious plaintiffs that had that extra push in their life, that something else to go out into the world, it might not have ever, been cemented into our civil liberties regime, which I think is something worth remarking on. Just so we don't get lost in both of these legal cases here that I'm sure I'm stuttering through and that are boring, I want to make my point very clear. In both of these instances, the First Amendment speech rights of all Americans grew because of the actions of religious plaintiffs. That something else that pushed them into the world forever changed our views of what the First Amendment protects. And just because I can't resist it, one more freebie. Pierce versus Society of Sisters kind of served as the first acorn in our 14th Amendment due process jurisprudence. And this case involved an Oregon law that mandated public school attendance. An Episcopal and Catholic school challenged this law. And the immediate impact of this case was that they were allowed to teach students again. But what ended up coming from this case is that the Supreme Court recognized that parents have a right under the 14th Amendment to direct the upbringing of their children. And that, again, like going door to door and spreading advocacy, talking to your neighbors without the government's approval, seems like something that just should have existed. But until this case, an early case in 1925, it didn't. There wasn't this idea that parents should be able to go and direct how their children live their lives. So, as I've alluded to, these first few examples are kind of freebies. Most people enjoy a broad free speech right, and it's hard to find people who should argue that they shouldn't be able to put their children in whatever school they want to. The next examples are somewhat more contentious, but I think that something else is just as important in these contexts because it's something that allows us to interact with the world ourselves. And by interacting with the world and looking at these cases, we can come to understand our positions on what happens in these cases. So the first case that I want to look at has some pretty sad facts. It's In re Quinlan, a 1976 New Jersey Supreme Court case. And this case involved a daughter who, after a night of drinking, the alcohol had a negative interaction with some of the medication that she was prescribed by a doctor, and she fell into a vegetative state. And after the father discussed with religious elders and had deep prayer on the topic, he decided to make the hard decision to cease ventilation. However, the hospital refused. The father attempted to make his case on free exercise grounds, but the court rejected this plea. Instead, they focused on the right of privacy, and it's a topic that admittedly still generates a lot of controversy today. However, in this case, the New Jersey Supreme Court recognized that the right to refuse medical treatment is protected under our implicit right to privacy, which I think is a little bit less contentious than what it's used for today. But here again is another example of a person compelled by their religious beliefs who tested the limits of our civil liberties regime. I think that this is fundamentally a good thing, even if you don't agree with the outcome, because although you may hate this outcome, understanding the limits of what our law can and should prohibit is something that's very important. And finally, I want to go to something that might used to have been controversial, but I think has kind of shifted well into the Overton window, which is conscientious objection. And this kind of follows the opposite approach, where religious people kind of pioneered this right. And traditionally, these objections were only for people that were from devout members of pacifist religions. And over time, the court was faced to deal with novel claim after novel claim until Congress, by the time Vietnam had come around, had finally just made a law protecting conscientious objectors. In comes United States versus Seeger, where Seeger was a plaintiff who wasn't religious in the meaning of the word, in the traditional meaning of the word. Instead, he manifested a, quote, belief in and devotion to goodness and virtue for their own sakes, and a religious faith and purely ethical creed, end quote. And in hearing this case, the court broadened the definition to include sincerely held moral convictions. And what this case did is allowed individuals, regardless of religious affiliation, to be recognized for their deeply held religious beliefs. And so in this way, these plaintiffs benefited because in the past, that something else had motivated those prior religious plaintiffs to go out into the world and seek protections and to create laws that would protect conscious objectors. And here, that flows directly to these secular people. And in looking through these cases, I hope that it's become clear that the pursuit of religious liberty, even for a secular person, has distinct benefits. These benefits manifest in broader legal protections in areas of the law you might really enjoy. But in other areas of the law that you might contest with fiercely, I think it's shaped our political discourse in a very useful way. Whether you have that something else or not, I think it's hard to disagree with the fact that that something else has played a vital role in developing our democracy. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Zach. I really appreciated that presentation, and this image of the extra push into the world is really a beautiful visual metaphor for sort of the effort that it takes to go out and stand up for what you believe to be right. And we can respect people for that, even if we don't specifically agree with what they're asserting. So thank you very much for that. Matthew Zavarro is going to next take the podium. Matt, over to you.
Thank you. I've been kind of roaming around here today, really nervous, but also excited. I'm like our representative who unfortunately had to leave early. I've got more experience behind a gas station cash register instead of a podium. But anyway, I wanted to talk about doubt a little bit today and to challenge us all to think about points in our religious journeys where we had doubts and how we could lean on those feelings that we once had, no matter how zealous we are in our faith today, to establish common ground and be able to talk more openly with people who are non-believers or just believers of different faith. Excuse me. I wanted to open first by talking about President Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut. It's something we talked about in clinic with Professor Collis, and it's something that I think kind of establishes a recognition of uncertainty in in our First Amendment jurisprudence. After that, I'm going to focus more on a discussion of doubt that's based on a book called Introduction to Christianity by Pope Benedict XVI. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how I think doubt could improve our discourse. In late 1801, the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Association wrote President Thomas Jefferson congratulating him on winning the election and expressing their sentiments that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals, that no man ought to suffer on account of his religious opinions, that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill to his neighbor. And President Jefferson replied to them, basically affirming their convictions and stating, religion is a matter which lies solely between a man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship. Implicit in their ideas, I think, and also implicit in the original meaning of the Free Exercise Clause and the First Amendment in general, is that our world is plagued with uncertainty. And all of us, no matter how faithful we are, have struggled with doubt at some point. And no individual, no government is so superior to us on a moral or ethical level that they should be able to tell us what to believe. But that doubt, that uncertainty is why we have to recognize that we also can't impose our beliefs on others. And it's why we should be more receptive to other people's opinions and conversations. In 1968, Pope Benedict XVI, who is technically not yet the Pope, published the book Introduction to Christianity. In the opening, he puts doubt at the forefront, but he doesn't pose it as an impediment to faith, or even as a sign of the weakness of a person's faith. He poses it more as a rite of passage, something that's necessary to the development of serious, passionate faith. This is a little bit of a longer excerpt, but I really like it, so bear with me if you don't mind. He writes, "Both the believer and unbeliever share, each in his own way, doubt and belief. If they do not hide from themselves and from the truth of their being, neither can quite escape doubt or belief. For the one, faith is present against doubt. For the other, through doubt and in the form of doubt. It is the basic pattern of man's destiny only to be allowed to find the finality of his existence in this unceasing rivalry between doubt and belief, temptation and certainty. Perhaps in precisely this way, doubt, which saves both sides from being shut up in their own worlds, could become the avenue of communication. It prevents both from enjoying complete self-satisfaction. It opens up the believer to the doubter, and the doubter to the believer." Obviously, I lean towards agreeing with him. The wrestle with doubt is how we find finality and how we strengthen our faith. But even outside the context of religion, taking something as true without question rarely results in the sort of lively, passionate, and persuasive belief that we get after wrestling with contradicting opinions. And that's part of the reason why we have the free speech clause. In fact, the justifications for free speech are extremely instructive here. One of my favorite justifications is from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, where he explained that the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it robs the human race. He says it robs those who dissent from the opinion more than those who agree with it. Because if the opinion is right, the dissenters are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. And if the opinion is wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Again, doubt about religious beliefs works the same way. It's something that can foster debate, which results in either the opportunity to exchange error for truth or a clearer perception of what we believe in. Leaning on our feelings of doubts can enrich our society, but we do have to use it tactfully. This isn't a call to, approach discourse ready to denounce our faiths. This is more about keeping us humble, keeping us vulnerable, and being willing to concede where you've made a leap of faith and where you're asking someone else to do so. It's not only relevant to our discourse, but it's also something that should inspire us to give deference to the free will of others and their actions and religious practices. I wanted to just conclude with an example of why no one is above doubt. The phrase doubting Thomas comes from the Bible. It describes St. Thomas the Apostle, who refused to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead when the other apostles had told them of the good news of Christ's resurrection. In John chapter 20, verse 25, Thomas said, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." It just goes to show that even the most righteous among us is weak. And truly, the doubts that we've all struggled with are a source of common ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. You were channeling Judge Learned Hand in a lot of your remarks. He is widely regarded as the greatest judge who never served on the Supreme Court. And in a talk about the spirit of liberty, he talked about that the spirit of liberty includes the capacity to doubt. And years later, as a very old man, he was giving a speech at Harvard. And I just want to read a short excerpt, Matt, because it made me think of you as I was listening. This is what Learned Hand said. He said, "I beseech ye, in the bowels of Christ, think that ye may be mistaken. I should like to have that written over the portals of every church, every school, and every courthouse, and may I say, of every legislative body in the United States. I should like to have every court begin, I beseech ye, in the bowels of Christ, think that we may be mistaken." In the past, I've thought about writing a book entitled "The Right Way to Be Wrong." And I think most of us are wrong most of the time about most things, including myself. And so given that we're so likely to be wrong, we ought to doubt a little bit more and use that doubt as a mechanism for not just intellectual humility, but perhaps real humility as well. So thank you for that very deep and insightful approach to thinking about religious freedom. Our third student speaker is Hannah Bottorff. Hannah, over to you.
Great. Well, those were two really good speeches to follow, and y'all have great things to say, as always. So in 6th grade, I learned my best friend could not eat marshmallows. I was shocked. She couldn't eat s'mores. She couldn't eat my favorite dessert, Mississippi Mud, which is a brownie covered in chocolate icing and marshmallow cream. It's delicious, by the way, if you do eat marshmallows. And I just remember asking her, "Why can you not eat marshmallows?" And she patiently explained, because marshmallows have gelatin, and gelatin is a byproduct of pork. My friend was Muslim, and this would be only one of many learning experiences I had that year, as I came to understand what she believed and how that affected her life. While learning about the marshmallows was important for me as her friend, I needed to know I couldn't bring, a piece of Mississippi Mud to share for lunch. I had to bring a different dessert. I learned that there were other more important things about her religion, and I started noticing that the school didn't seem to understand these things either. So school cafeteria often didn't have many options for those with dietary restrictions, even for friends who were vegetarian as part of their religious practice. And the PE dress code, with its standard t-shirt and shorts, didn't provide room for accommodations. Representative Bajani earlier mentioned how STAR tests would often be scheduled even on religious holidays. Overall, it seemed that there was a lack of awareness about students with different religious beliefs, and that lack of awareness played itself out in policies that were often unhelpful and even at times alienating. This lack of understanding about what people believe is a problem with religious literacy, a problem America as a whole struggles with. I minored in religious studies in college, and one of the books that we read was Religious Literacy by Stephen Prothero. The book highlighted America's religious illiteracy. That is, the average citizen's lack of understanding about the basics of the world's religions doctrines. A 2019 Pew Research study surveyed about 11,000 Americans, asking them 32 fact-based multiple-choice questions about religion. And the average adult scored less than half. I was curious as to how I would have done on the survey, and perhaps as people invested in the topic of religious freedom, and perhaps religion more broadly, you may be curious too. So I'm going to read 5 questions, and you can keep track of how many you know. Which Bible figure is most closely associated with leading the Exodus from Egypt? Moses. In the Muslim tradition, believers have a religious obligation to make a pilgrimage to Islam's holiest city at least once during their lifetime, if they are able. Which city is that? It's Mecca. Which religious tradition is most closely associated with yoga? Very popular pastime nowadays. Hinduism. In which religious tradition are men generally required to wear a turban in public and carry a ceremonial sword and small dagger? Sikhism. And which religious tradition is most closely associated with Kabbalah? It's Judaism. Now, if you knew at least 3 of them, can you raise your hand? Great, so that's more than 50%, so most of y'all know more than the average American. Maybe to be expected in a conference about religious liberty. Anyone know all 5? Great, better than me. I didn't know the last one. As I was answering these questions, I felt very confident about the ones that involved my own religion. I'm a Protestant Christian, so the questions about Moses, the 10 Commandments, teaching about salvation through faith alone, those came easily for me. But I had to think a little harder about the questions involving religions other than my own. And this natural tendency to know more about other religion, to know more about your own religion than others, is entirely understandable. But a lack of awareness about other religions entirely, that's what can often lead to what Professor Douglas Laycock, a renowned religious liberty scholar, termed the Puritan mistake. The Puritans were known for coming to America to seek religious freedom. And yet, once they were here, they instituted laws that only protected their religion. And so the Puritan mistake is to seek religious freedom only for oneself while denying it to others. This mistake can be caused not only intentionally, but also unintentionally through a lack of religious literacy. For example, let's say there's a law that provides dress code exemptions specifically for religious headgear. Now, this law might unintentionally be under-inclusive of other types of religious clothing. So even if the law meant to promote religious freedom very broadly, just through the lack of awareness about other types of clothing than headgear, it could end up only providing religious liberty for some and not for others. Now, our clinic was involved with a religious group that people often know little about, the Amish. In this case, the government required every home to have a septic system, which a specific Amish community objected to installing on religious grounds. Now, something you might not know, I certainly did not before hearing about this case, is that each Amish community decides for themselves what technology to adopt. All adults over 18 evaluate whether the technology would change their spiritual way of life. For example, the community decided to adopt flashlights, but not headlamps. And part of their reasoning was that a child could hold a flashlight and be part of the work, just as they had previously held lanterns. But a headlamp, that would remove the opportunity for the kid to be involved. So, making a decision about a new technology is a very thoughtful decision, made by the entire community. and the community must reach a unanimous agreement to adopt the new technology. And every community makes their own decisions. So with this system, 2 congregations could make different decisions. But it's not arbitrary. It's an intentional process with religious implications. Perhaps if the government had understood that, had taken time to understand what the Amish believe and how that affects their lives, then maybe there wouldn't have been a need for a court case. Policy decisions are being made every day in legislatures, schools, businesses, policies that will affect religious practice. And yet, how often is the effect on religion actively considered when creating these policies? How often is a religion other than the majority one considered? And how many policymakers know about religions other than their own? There are many religiously literate and considerate people who make time to understand relevant stakeholders' interests and to understand the beliefs of those in their community. I'm very encouraged by the turnout today, for example. But there are also many court cases challenging policies that affect religious exercise. But it shouldn't fall solely on the courts to determine how and when policies should take into account religion. Policymakers on the front end should be proactive in trying to understand the beliefs of their communities and how those beliefs shape lifestyles. In other words, building their religious literacy. With this understanding, they can then create laws and policies while actively considering the impacts of such policies on religion. And this matters, of course, on a societal level, but it also matters on an individual, personal level. Being willing to learn about what your friends and neighbors believe and how that affects their lives will deepen your relationships and communicate that you care about them. Remember that religious literacy begins with listening. For me, I learned a lot just by asking why my friend could not eat marshmallows.
Well, I'd like to congratulate Professor Steve Cullis for having such great students. Steve, you must be really proud of the presentations that have been made here. So earlier when we were talking with the high school students, I asked a question about what folks of your generation, their generation, would like older folks of my generation to know about your generation. And I thought I'd begin with that question for the 3 of you, and let's go in reverse order. So Hannah, then Matt, then Zach. And then I'd like to really open it to the floor so that we can have as much time for audience questions as possible. So be ready with questions, and perhaps we have a microphone that will be passed. If not, I'll repeat the question so that it gets recorded for those who are listening online. Hannah, what do us old-timers need to know about kids these days?
I think to repeat one of the points I made, in my speech, I think a lot of people in our generation might not be religiously literate, and so I think approaching our generation with maybe a standpoint of education, of not assuming the common knowledge that may have been present in older generations. People on the one hand might have access to more friends who have different religions. So on the one hand, they might know a little bit about a lot of different religions, but then on the other hand, their knowledge might not always be very deep if they haven't, had any type of religious education. And just with our generation in general becoming, unchurched and things like that, just making sure to start with that, and not just assume, just because your religion has generally been the majority that people might know about it. And so just starting with that education, and that might actually solve a lot of the problems if they can understand that, because I do think our generation is willing to listen, but may need that education first.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great reminder, even for those of us who teach law and religion, because often the cases involve religious groups that people may not be so familiar with. And, there's an old joke about law professors where, this is sort of about me because I started teaching business associations, and I was lucky to stay a week ahead of my students. And 20 years later, it was amazing how much I had learned about business associations, and I could really talk about it from A to Z. And the only thing that was unfortunate is the students just hadn't kept up. And, for those of us who are experts in any field, it's easy to sort of forget what it feels like to not be an expert. And so I really like that suggestion, Hannah. Matt, what would you want us to understand?
I don't have too much to add, so I'm going to piggyback off of Hannah's answer since it was really good. I think starting with the basics is really helpful for us, and not using jargon that's too advanced, not going too deep into the theology just right off the bat when you're talking to someone about religious beliefs, and really kind of spoon feeding us is really helpful.
All right, so that kind of goes contrary to some of our training as law professors as well, but I think, again, it goes to this point that, when you've been doing something for a long time, what might seem obvious to you or elementary may not be for those who are incomers to sort of a new profession, a new way of talking, a new vocabulary, a new, even way of thinking and so forth. And so I think that's a good reminder for those of us in the legal profession because, a lot of people think they know more about the legal profession than they might about engineering or doctoring because we've watched a lot of shows on TV. But it turns out that, becoming a lawyer and thinking like a lawyer is actually a process that is involves more specialized knowledge and ways of approaching problem solving than we may remember when we've been at it for a long time. Zach, what would you add?
Yeah, I think I just like to talk to kind of the enormous social pressure people feel to kind of conform nowadays. And I think a big point here is if you talk to people, most people are really decent, especially if you get them one-on-one and you are just talking about your ideas. In my entire time at law school with people I disagree with on every issue, if we sit and we get lunch, we could have a pleasant conversation. And it's going to be different than what we're going to have in a classroom when we're arguing back and forth. So I just kind of remind about that pressure.
Yeah, boy, the pressure to conform, I think, is real. And I don't know if it's social media has accelerated it in some ways, but I think there is a lot of pressure to sort of keep your head down and sort of, go along with sort of prevailing conventions and conventional wisdom. And for those of us who have been around for a while, it's amazing how much conventional wisdom changes over time, and yet it's also amazing the confidence with which conventional wisdom is held, as if it's going to be stable and unchanging for a long time. All right, let me open it to the floor, and if we have several hands, I'll take a couple questions and then let our panel address them in one answer. Paul, thanks. This is Professor Paul Carey.
Thank you very much. It's excellent to hear your views, especially as you articulate them and you really went in different directions, helpful for all of us. I'd be interested to know, Texas law, and particularly your center, Beck Laughlin and the clinic, you've developed a reputation for being particularly balanced. You represent the entire First Amendment, as well as, of course, the bits of the First Amendment that we're speaking about today. The cases that you take on are also really, I think, demonstrative of seeking to protect the rights for all, not really pushed too much in an ideological position. I think that speaks to your generation as well. How might all of us learn to do that better, to be able to truly say this First Amendment and religious freedom is truly for all and mustn't be used as an ideological football? And I think your clinic and Texas law demonstrates So please respond as you will.
All right, just for those who are listening online who may not have picked up the question, it had to do with the clinic at UT Austin and the First Amendment Center and its reputation for being very balanced and for really standing up for the principle of these rights for everyone and not really just pursuing them for a particular favored group. Have you felt that? How do you react to that observation about the clinic at Texas? Any of you? So all of you. We'd like to hear each of you respond.
I guess I'm starting. So I want to start with the comment about ideological football. And I feel like the reason the clinic has done so good at avoiding that is because we talk about things in terms of the principles and in terms of where the principles would take us. I don't think we've had a single conversation from an ideological perspective. And I'm going to toot Professor Collis's horn here and give him a lot of credit for that, because he's really good at teaching us how to break down principles and think about what principles we're trying to further instead of thinking about just the end that we're trying to go after. And he's also a professional devil's advocate, and he always knows how to get you to think about the opposing side, which is something that I've also felt has contributed very considerably to, the principles-based reasoning and logic instead of ideological football.
Thanks, Matt. That's a great answer. It reminds me of one of my favorite professors in law school. His name was Michael Reisman, and he was so fair-minded that I thought to myself, this is the one person I've ever met in my life who I would trust to be a judge in their own case, because he just had this knack for taking the opposite side and articulating it in a way that was far more persuasive than whoever it was that was advocating for that counterpoint. So I'm glad you have Professor Collis in your life. That's a good role model for you to have. Hannah, what would you add?
I don't think I have too much to add. I think, I have learned so much about different religions just through our cases that, I didn't know about their beliefs, but they were facing challenges and needed, legal representation. And I think, the clinic actively seeks out those disputes, but at the same time, they're also happening. So I think, one way to maybe, if you're trying to reflect, in your own life, what we have is to actively look for people who are having conflicts that are in some ways maybe similar to your own with your own religion, but in other ways involve different communities. And so I think trying to be actively aware of that, whether through news or whether through joining community groups, you'll find that people actually are facing a lot of similar struggles, even if the beliefs are a little different.
Yeah, thanks. I think that emphasis again on what you talked about during your presentation of literacy, of knowing something about each other is so important. So Zach, as a self-described sort of secular person, have you felt welcome in the Religious Liberty Clinic?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't want to make Professor Collis blush too much more, but I think it starts with kind of honesty with yourself. Do you care about these principles? And the answer for everyone that works there is that yes, they care about the underlying principles, because I think sometimes principles are cloaked in trying to get to other objectives, and I don't like that dishonesty, because I think that there's a lot of good ways to get at specific issues. If that's your thing, don't cloak it in anything else. I think you'll come out much better if you just say, this is what I believe and I'm going for it. But trying to use general principles to get there, I think just kind of muddies the water. And that's absolutely not what goes on with Professor Collis. I've always felt super welcome in the clinic, and it's been awesome.
I'm so glad. So we have about 5 minutes left. Let me open the floor once again. If we have a final question, Mark Romney, do you want to?
Being now 2 generations removed from your age.
I'd say 3.
It is a tension amongst all different generations. The older generations think the young ones are just going to hell in a handbasket. and the younger ones think that the older ones just screwed things up so badly they'll never recover. From your standpoint in life, knowing your peers, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the things that you're studying and how those will have an impact on the world in the future?
All right, thanks. Why don't we go in reverse order? So Zach, why don't we start with you, and then Matt, and then Hannah will give you the last word.
Yeah, I think I'm very optimistic. Just going to classes, and I think that always on the fringes there are people who just can't see other perspectives, but I think that that's probably always existed throughout generations. Maybe it's not been quite as loud because you can't pull out your phone 60 years ago and talk about your opinion on the First Amendment, probably thankfully. But I really am optimistic because, as I was talking about earlier, people are generally just good. People I don't agree with on very much at all. Even some of my best friends are people we barely agree about much, but they're just wonderful people. So I'm very optimistic.
Thanks, Matt.
I'm going to ride the line a little bit. I'm optimistic at what I've seen at UT Law, and I think everyone there is actually extremely compassionate and has their heart in the right place, no matter what we disagree on. But I have to confess that working at gas stations, I did not always have the best experiences. I think I'll probably just leave it at that.
I think one thing to remember about our generation is that generally we're growing up, potentially in some very inclusive times, or at least inclusivity seems to be a value of our generation. It's hard to speak broadly, but in general, I feel like our generation really values inclusivity. And I think that there's some tension, as the First Liberty people were talking about with cases. One of the main tensions we talk about in the clinic is potential, tensions between LGBTQ, rights and religious rights, and those are sort of the cases that are coming a lot in tension. And I think that that's what our generation might have to deal with the most, is testing what does inclusivity mean for us? What does equality mean for us? So I think that as the other two say, I'll say overall optimism, but I do think there's a tension that we'll deal with as the demographics change and everything else, and beliefs change. But I do think that it is encouraging to me that people do seem to value inclusivity, and I hope that value can be appealed to with religious liberty.
All right, let me ask you to join me in thanking this wonderful panel of law students. And Bill is going to come tell us we're due for a 10-minute break, and we'll start promptly at 5.
So personally instructive. Thank you so much. So we'll take this 10-minute break and see you back for the next session on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
I really did enjoy your article, by the way.